Hello everyone and thanks for joining us. I'm Charlotte Teunissen. I'm a professor in neurochemistry and I work at Amsterdam University Medical Centers. I chair the BBB PIA and BBB stands for Body Fluid Biomarkers. Today I'm delighted to be talking with Rik Ossenkoppele. Hi Rik, can I start by asking you to introduce yourself and tell us which PIA you are involved with?
Hi, Charlotte. Many thanks and great having this conversation with you today. So my name is Rik Ossenkoppele. I also work at the Amsterdam University Medical Centers, but then at the Alzheimer's Center. I also have an affiliation at the University of Lund, and I am currently the vice chair of the Atypical Alzheimer's disease professional interest area.
That's very interesting. Perhaps you can start with a little bit discussion of your research. So what brought you to dementia research?
Right. So often from dementia researchers, you hear about personal situations. I don't have that. So there are not many dementia cases in my family. I actually for the first time really encountered it during my studies. So I studied neuropsychology, and I was testing individuals suspected of having Alzheimer's disease. And while doing all these tests, like assessing memory and language and visual spatial functions and so on, I really realized what a diverse disease it is. So there was so much variability in the way people progressed. Sometimes very fast, sometimes very slow. The kind of symptoms people had. Some had very strong memory impairments. Others were more impaired in their behavior or in language, etc. And that really got me fascinated, and especially when I found out that we actually know very little also about the neurobiology of Alzheimer's disease, and there is actually no cure for it. So all that together, a very interesting clinical phenotype, lack of sufficient knowledge of disease mechanisms, and lack of a cure made me and still makes me super motivated to work on this topic.
So what's your specialty most? Is it neuropsychological testing, or I thought you were also working on imaging?
Yeah, that's actually what I'm doing mostly nowadays. So what I'm trying to do is to understand disease progression in general, and mainly through neuroimaging, but also more recently through biofluid markers, as you know, Charlotte. And in that work, I thumbs up. And in that work, I focus on many things. So one of them is trying to predict the rate of clinical progression of individuals, but also trying to understand why someone manifests with memory impairment and other ones with non-amnestic presentations, and also why some people with lots of pathology actually progress very slowly over time, whereas other ones only need a little bit of Alzheimer's pathology before they show quite severe symptoms. So I'm very interested in why all these differences in disease progression occur, and I studied that using imaging and biofluid markers.
And is your focus on mostly people who are diagnosed with dementia, or also the earlier stages?
Yeah, so I focus on both stages, but I would say that my focus is a little bit different. So the heterogeneity of the disease in terms of the clinical manifestation, I mainly study in the symptomatic stage. That's also when symptoms actually occur, and it's easier actually to also detect differences in the way they present. But I'm also very interested in cognitively unimpaired individuals. For example, having amyloid and tau in the brain, and what that means for progression. So the big question is, can we call this Alzheimer's disease, or are they just at risk? This is a big debate in the field at the moment.
Yeah. So that brings me to the next question, but maybe I know the answer because I saw a LinkedIn post of you yesterday. But what are the hot topics in your field, and especially in the PIA related fields?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there I would mainly focus on the atypical forms of Alzheimer's disease. So first, let me quickly define it. So with atypical Alzheimer's disease, we mainly refer to clinical phenotypes of Alzheimer's disease that are non-amnestic. So, for example, individuals that have severe behavioral impairments, so they look a lot clinically like, for example, fronto-temporal dementia, but in fact they have Alzheimer's disease pathology. And similar phenotypes that are driven by Alzheimer's disease pathology also exist where, for example, the visual spatial problems are key, or people have a lot of troubles in language, for example, speech production or understanding of language, or dysexecutive functions where they have a lot of trouble, for example, planning or in inhibition, for example. So really understanding these atypical phenotypes of Alzheimer's disease is very important. So a hot topic is still to timely diagnose them, because their diagnosis is often missed. If they present at a clinic, many times the initial thought is about something else, and that causes often like a delay of many years, right? Which causes uncertainty for the individuals and their surroundings, but also delays like sufficient patient management. So really trying to accelerate the diagnostic process.
Oh yeah. And do you have any discoveries lately in this field, or the field itself, also without you?
Right, exactly. Yeah, so maybe I can actually talk a little bit about some of our own work. So many of the Alzheimer's disease phenotypes, so for example the visual spatial or the language variants, they have diagnostic criteria, and that really improves the diagnostic process. So clinicians are really better able to diagnose this category. But that wasn't actually available for the behavioral variant of Alzheimer's disease until very recently. And actually last year we published the first research criteria for this variant. So there are now actually very concrete criteria that researchers and clinicians can use to diagnose this variant. And I think an accurate diagnosis of these atypical forms of Alzheimer's disease is especially important with many potential disease-modifying drugs at the horizon, where it's crucial, right? If you're targeting amyloid or tau, that those pathologies are actually also present in the brain. So we're targeting the right population.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's very helpful to the field. And how did PIA help your research?
Yeah, so I think the PIA really provides a very strong network in general, and maybe I can give two examples of that. So there's one initiative that is led by Mariana Chaplot and Gil Rabinovich from the University of California in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. And what they are doing is that they are performing a meta-analysis for posterior cortical atrophy, and that is the visual variant of Alzheimer's disease. And what they're doing is they're collecting data from many sites across the entire world. For example, they're looking at all sorts of clinical variables, but they also look at amyloid and tau status. They look at genetic information, and by pooling those data, because it's a relatively rare variant, and only by pooling data you can establish, the contributions of all sorts of neurobiological factors. You can say more meaningful things about the clinical presentation. And one thing that actually the PIA facilitated is that apart from all the published work, because in the literature you can see which groups are actually working on posterior cortical atrophy. Mm-hmm. Through the PIA, we were actually able to reach out to many groups that have not published on this phenotype, but actually do see them in their clinics. And they were also part of this big meta-analysis now. So the total sample size has increased massively through the PIA. So I think that is one really nice example.
Yeah, it's really nice. Yeah.
Yeah, perhaps I can also mention another one that was an initiative started a few years ago. It's actually also about the visual presentation of Alzheimer's disease. And you can imagine that the traditional neuropsychological tests don't work for this population, because visual information is not processed as well as people that don't have this particular phenotype. So you need a lot of non-visual cognitive tests. And they vary a lot across centers, and perhaps the interpretation differs also a lot across centers. So the idea here was to write a white paper to discuss what are the best cognitive tests for a particular domain, and try to harmonize it across centers all around the world. So when we talk about a particular domain or impairments in this case, we are talking about the same thing. So the results become more meaningful, the diagnosis becomes better, and there's more uniform data collection for this group.
And when you talk about visual spatial impairments or visual processing, can you give an example? Because I am not familiar with the construct so much. But what
Yeah,
kind of problems do the patients encounter?
exactly. So it's a very wide array of symptoms. So in general, when people think about Alzheimer's disease, they think about memory problems, right? So
Mm-hmm.
trouble retrieving very recent events, for example, uh, not recognizing faces or names. Um, Well, actually, if you are sitting in front of an individual with posterior cortical atrophy or the visual variant of Alzheimer's disease, you will notice that actually the memory is often quite intact. So you can have conversations about, yesterday's news, for example, or a football game you've both watched. But they suffer from very different problems. And just an example is they can have trouble, for example, distinguishing left from right.
Oh,
They have
right.
they have difficulties recognizing particular faces or objects. They have trouble putting their clothes on. They have trouble navigating through space. Sometimes there are difficulties in color perception or motion perception. So
Oh,
everything
really?
related to vision, or actually the processing of visual information, some of these elements get impaired.
Yeah, so it can be anything, or it's a very wide variety of symptoms then.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
There, there's a wide variety. There's actually in the diagnostic criteria there's quite an extensive list, and if you meet three of them, you would actually be classified as posterior cortical atrophy,
oh
but
yeah,
only when it is an early and prominent symptom. So often during the course of Alzheimer's disease, people also develop
yeah.
visual spatial problems, but it needs to be very early on, and it also needs to be the most prominent symptom.
Oh yeah, yeah. Okay, and in order for the clinical diagnosis of the visual variants of Alzheimer's disease. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And now a little bit more about the PIA again. Can you tell a little bit more about the committee and how your group is organized?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So we are a group consisting of mostly researchers around the world, actually. So our current chair is Jennifer Whitwell. I'm the vice chair myself. We have Keir Young, who is the programs chair. Baila Bone, who you also know because she worked in Amsterdam as well, is the communications chair. We have a junior trainee called Rosalina Mohenti. And the immediate past chair is Femke Bouwman. So she was
Oh,
the chair last year and is still involved, also from Amsterdam, as you know. Yeah, and we are organized in a way that we meet on a regular basis, normally every four to 6 weeks.
oh, that's not.
Yeah, and we discuss everything that's related to atypicality in Alzheimer's disease.
Oh, yeah. And do you also have working groups?
Yeah, we have working group. So the project about the cognitive testing in the visual variant of Alzheimer's disease is an example of that. So
Yeah,
that was really based on a working group, for example. Yeah.
yeah. Oh, yeah. Very interesting. And how can early career researchers who are now listening become involved?
Yeah, first of all, they are more than welcome. We welcome them with open arms. So there are a couple of things to consider. So early career researchers that have, for example, specific ideas or questions or are looking for collaborations, they can send an email to our communications chair. That is Baila Bone. You can find our email address on our website, and maybe we can even include the email address in the show notes of this podcast. Or people who know my email address can also email me, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can include it, for example, in our newsletter that we send out, or we can put it on our webpage. We have a Twitter account, so we can share
Oh,
everything related to that. So that is one way to spread ideas. Another idea is we're always looking for people that are interested in participating, for example, in journal clubs or webinars. So if people have ideas, please contact us. And maybe the most direct way to become involved is actually to become a part of the executive committee.
mm.
The new positions will come available very soon. So we always have one junior trainee in our committee. So people that are interested, I encourage to apply for that position.
Okay. That's a nice call. And what kind of other activities do you have planned for the upcoming year? Or will the early career researchers have opportunities to meet you at AIC? Are there any sessions planned, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So two things. About the aims of our PIA first. So like the past couple of years, we organized many journal clubs and webinars. For example, last year we had one on the behavioral variant of Alzheimer's disease. And we had another one on language presentations of Alzheimer's disease, where there's still a lot of debate. About the specifics. We had three experts debating each other. That was actually really nice. The other one is what we further aim to do is, so far in our committee we have mainly people working in either sort of the neuropsychological or biomarker aspects of Alzheimer's disease, as well as neuropathology. But we would actually welcome more people that work in health or social care, because we think our PIA is very relevant for that as well. You can imagine if you care for individuals with Alzheimer's disease, it matters a lot what kind of symptoms they have, what needs they have. So we would really like to welcome people that are engaged in that particular field. And finally, this is not definite yet, but we have reached out actually to an editor, because we plan to write a textbook based on atypical Alzheimer's disease, where we describe in detail the clinical presentation, everything we know about the neurobiology, about the care system in place, future directions. So that's probably not going to be achieved within the next year, but that is on our agenda for the near future.
Yeah, so you really plan to define atypical AD. Do you think in the long term, just on the contents still, will it stay like a subtype of AD, or do you think that it may even become a separate disease entity?
Yeah, this is actually a great question. So we quickly touched upon the hot topics in the field, and I think we only had the opportunity to discuss one, but this is definitely another one. And I think you can approach this from two sides. So one is, should we actually treat them separately, or should we consider it as an entire continuum? So you have Alzheimer's disease, and it goes in different directions. And what we now call atypical are just the extremes of a continuum. That is a possibility, and which I think is the most likely possibility. Reason is they share the same neurobiology. So they have amyloid plaques, they have tau tangles. The only thing is they have them, especially the tau tangles, in different parts of the brain. And the parts of the brain and the networks, the tangles deposit, that has a major influence in the clinical manifestation. So I think it's the same disease, but there's just a different manifestation.
Yeah. Yeah, and it might, because it's the same biology, probably they need the same treatment if you want to target the biology. But yeah, if the tangles are in different location, it's a different biology, you could argue. So
Yeah, right. But I guess if you are thinking about anti-tau or anti-amyloid treatments, I think that could apply to any phenotype of Alzheimer's disease. But I think it's quite likely that the mechanisms that make those proteins misfold, for example, that they could actually differ between subtypes.
yeah.
And maybe there's a different degree of the neuroinflammatory response, or there are specific cell types involved. So that there are many mechanisms that can potentially differ. So I agree with you that there are neurobiological differences. They have in common the presence of amyloid and tau pathology, but other neurobiological aspects are likely to be different.
Yeah, so it sounds like a very exciting field, because there is still a lot to be discovered. And nowadays we have the tools also for discovery, so it's a nice area to work in, I think. Okay, thank you. It's time to end today's podcast recording. But before we go, I do have a final question. So what advice would you give to any aspiring dementia researchers out there who are thinking of looking into dementia?
Yeah, that's a really nice question. So first of all, I think anyone that's considering it is entering a very dynamic field at the moment, right? So you are like one of the leaders in the biomarker field, where a lot has happened last year. For example, the advent of blood-based biomarkers. We have for the first time a disease-modifying treatment being approved by the FDA, although somewhat controversial whether it has a cognitive benefit, but there are many promising events happening and at the horizon. So I think it's actually a very good time to enter the field, because many things are changing. We're making good progress in understanding the disease. Good news is that there is still a lot of work to do, as you said. So we definitely need to understand the disease better. My advice to early career researchers is really to follow your curiosity. That has always driven me. If you're working on a problem that generally interests you, you will work on it automatically. The motivation is intrinsic. You will be fascinated by studying it and learning more about it. So follow your interest, and the rest will follow suit.
Yeah, so that's a fantastic advice. So thank you to Rik for taking time to join us today, and also for the listeners.